So maybe what we wanted was actually just a scene between Zeus and Poseidon right at the beginning of the show where they're on top of the Empire
Where he
State
says,
Building.
Zeus, Poseidon, it's been many years. What do you see? Thunderclouds, but no lightning. Stolen. What, you think I took it?
Every time I forget you have that entire scene memorized.
Omnipotence has blinded you, brother. We're forbidden from... Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Monster Donut, a literary and historical deep dive into the Percy Jackson series and all of its following spin-offs. I'm Phoebe, a dramaturg and story consultant.
And I'm Emily, a classic scholar-ish.
Today we'll be talking about episode 2 of the Percy Jackson TV series, I Become Supreme Lord of the Bathroom.
Y'all, so much has happened since we last recorded. We went to the premiere.
Yes, we went to the premiere. It was so much fun. It was so much fun.
We got to see the first 2 episodes fully rendered in an audience. I really think they should be playing this show in theaters. It's so much fun, like in a theater.
Yeah, I want to see the whole show in a crowd of fans.
And so thank you all so much for listening and for supporting us and for
making that happen.
Making that happen, honestly, genuinely. It's been so great to get to experience the launch of this show this way and to get to really get to talk to everybody involved and it's just so cool. Are we ready to get into it?
Yes. But first, same morning as last episode, there will be spoilers in our discussion for the entire book series. So if you haven't read the books or you haven't listened to those episodes, we will be referring back to them a lot. All right. Episode 2.
I thought it was interesting once you pointed it out for episode 1 that we open on the storm again.
Yes. It's the storm. The same storm. This is the third character introduction that we've gotten that's like this, where they're out of focus and it's the same storm out. The first was Percy, who's out of focus as he narrates in the very first scene of the show. So, as a first-time viewer, you're trying to make out where he is and who he is. He's just this blurry figure until he actually steps close enough for you to see him. And then the second one is Kronos, who just remains out on the horizon in the fog and just far enough that we can't make him out yet. Although we'll hear more from Eric and Jeff about that eventually. But we still haven't gotten to see him clearly yet. And now we have Annabeth, who is behind cloth, and we're seeing her through bleary eyes. And then we'll see her later again in this episode, but she's still, for us, hasn't quite made it into focus. She didn't quite make it into focus in her introduction, and so she's still a little bit of a mystery that we have to solve. And so I just find all 3 of these and how or whether they show their faces to us in their introduction symbolic of how we kind of get to know them at the beginning. Because Percy, steps out of that fog and introduces himself and tells us directly who he is. And then Kronos talks a lot. Kronos just talks and talks and talks.
He does talk.
But never gets closer. He only slowly draws closer and we still can't see him. And, we might get a good look at Annabeth later in the episode, but who she is hasn't yet come out of her own mouth. Her story will only be told to us in this episode through Luke. Otherwise, she's still kind of blurry.
And it's interesting as well because Kronos, at least the way he's introduced, he's sort of who are you? What are you doing here? You're a nobody. Run away, little hero. Contrasted a little with Annabeth's, he must be the one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both of them to Percy being these sort of, in the middle of the night, these blurry figures who are just trying to figure him out.
Yeah. I always thought it was interesting, and this might just be me seeing things, and I couldn't tell if it was a flash of lightning when Annabeth's there or not, but Annabeth was there, in daylight. The storm wasn't outside.
Oh, I thought it looked like it was just lightning outside.
It could have been just lightning.
I thought you meant that, when Percy woke up at camp, it seemed like the storm had cleared up. There was no, at the end of the last episode, it was clear out.
It looked clear, yeah. I know, that's what I was thinking. I was I thought the storm had cleared, continuity-wise. So I was wondering if he was still, half stuck in a Kronos dream. That's why he was hearing it.
And so the next time Percy wakes up, he has Grover watching over him. And we see him realize that his mom is gone. And Grover clearly wants to talk about it with him, but he doesn't want to talk about it. And I don't remember if we talked about this in our Lightning Thief episode or if we've just talked about it a million other times when we've talked about Percy Jackson. But in the book, Percy realizes his mom is gone and starts to get lost in thoughts of like, I'm an orphan now. What am I going to do? I can't go home. I'm going to have to live on the street and join the army, I think. But then as he's like cycling through those thoughts, he looks over at Grover and realizes that Grover's afraid that Percy's going to be upset with him. And all of that energy just shifts toward comforting Grover and making sure that Grover knows it wasn't his fault. But in this scene, Grover's saying all of the same lines. Yeah, like, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to be your protector. Maybe if I'd told you the truth, your mom would still be here. And Percy just turns his back on him.
Yeah. He's like trying to get space because he's crying, and Grover is like, no, I need to talk to you. And he's like, stop.
Yeah. And I love, like we said last time, the fact that we're carrying through this tension between Percy and Grover that we have at the beginning.
Yeah. And I think in light of what you just said as well, it's really interesting that since now in this version, like, Percy's sort of got this, he's been introduced to the concept of like, oh, you have a father who's a god by Sally. And I think that's also what drives him into, instead of the thought process of like, what am I going to do? My mom's gone. I don't have anybody anymore. It's now, okay, where's my dad? I'm going to go find him.
It's just that immediate, I'm going to make him answer for this. That's big in this episode. That's an attitude that's going to be throughout this episode. But that was something that I really liked about this episode, is how Percy just does not understand how to play by the rules that we know this world operates under. Like the assumption that his dad is going to be here and just walking around like, show me my dad at Camp Half-Blood, or that he can pray at any fire and his mom will hear him later on. But he quickly learns what the rules of this world are when he heads outside and makes it to the porch, which is gorgeous.
Yeah.
And just all of the lighting and the colors of these scenes at Camp Half-Blood, like you pointed out in the last episode, the warmth when Grover appears, that like total shift from blue to orange. We get the same thing here, where there's just all of Camp Half-Blood is just very warm, where the first episode was a lot of blue. The camp is a lot of orange, and there's the stained glass in the porch, and you can see the beach with the canoes out by the lake.
And the mountains on Long Island.
It's funny because whenever I see a beach in the woods in Vancouver in a movie, I can't look at it without thinking of Camp Rock. It's all Camp Rock to me. Like, that's literally where Mitchie and Shane took a canoe out on the water.
It's a new expression, right? Not it's all Greek to me. It's all Camp Rock to me.
It's all Camp Rock to me. But while I was looking at this beautiful introduction to some of the sets at Camp Half-Blood, I was just thinking about that one line in The Lightning Thief where Percy sees Camp Half-Blood for the first time and thinks to himself, my mother was gone. The whole world should be black and cold. Nothing should look beautiful.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at the porch, because I'm obviously staring at all the backgrounds like, okay, what are the influences here? So first of all, I love the fact that when they turn the camera around to the side without the glass, that was the part I was really looking at that I thought was really cool, because there's all these gorgeous frescoes on the wall, and there's all these gorgeous, like, multicolored tiles. But what I found kind of interesting was I was staring at it, and I was like, this looks Roman to me. Like, it looks a lot more Roman than Greek. That being said, frescoes and wall paintings and decoration like that is definitely not exclusively Roman. But it's also very, very classical. You can actually see a lot of beautiful examples of Roman frescoes that were in villas and stuff. And that's what, like, the big house looked like mostly to me, was a villa, like a Roman villa. Like, the height of luxury.
Yeah. I didn't think about that. That's so true.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it looks like.
Right? Oh, yeah, because I'm sure you've seen a bunch of them.
I've seen many of them.
Yeah. And the way even when it's not a fresco or a painting, but the way the outlines of the wall with like the squares and stuff, the sort of like artificial painted column look, like that's all very Roman too.
Yeah.
And the reds especially, that screams Roman to me. Something else that I noticed the most recent time I watched it too was when we're introduced to Mr. D, the camera kind of pans and zooms onto him, and we just see him sitting at the table. And what really struck me was all of the candles that are surrounding him, even though they're not lit, and there's all this stained glass, and he's sitting at this like beautiful pink marble table. And I kept thinking, like, this looks almost like an altar. Because especially you see, I think stained glass comes more in much later periods because it's obviously pretty technical to achieve. That being said, colored glass was a thing even back in ancient Egyptian times. So that all feels a bit more modern to me, the stained glass. And the designs on the stained glass also all look a lot more modern to me. They're all a lot more geometric, especially in like the Hermes cabin. So I thought it was interesting that Percy's sort of approaching Dionysus, and Dionysus is sitting at what looks like an altar, although he's also got his, can of Coke and his deck of cards right there. I think now's a good time to cut in our clip where we asked about Mr. D's introduction from Jon, Dan, and James. I was also really fascinated by the portrayal of Mr. D, especially in the second episode, because that's when we really first get to meet him, because he sort of serves as our introduction to the gods. So I was really curious, both from the writing and directorial perspective, what your approach was in terms of really nailing down that like first encounter.
I mean, Jason's hired Jason man. Yeah, that part of this is you just wind him up and let him go and make sure the camera focus. I think it felt like a good opportunity to in a very silly way establish that idea that the gods are going to use you to do things they can't do for themselves, and not have it feel like you're eating your vegetables when you heard it. And so I think in the midst of all of the confusion of Percy waking up in that camp, it felt like the right time to just have somebody put that on the map and let it sit there. But also because Jason is so very human. Yeah. Yeah. That's why he's a good introduction to the idea. Yeah. Because Percy, like us, we're learning that is Dionysus. And he does not seem like a god when you meet that guy. And that is a very important part of this. So I think that gives a really good introduction in that terms too. Because people don't know the books, that's a really great idea. This guy's a god. You go, what? And again, you're learning through Percy's eyes, which is what we're doing most of the time, which is what's very interesting.
What struck me a lot was how human he seemed. So I was curious if that was the direction they went in, and it was.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking a lot about at the end of the scene.
Oh yeah, that's actually where I made that note.
Yeah, that's that really short moment with Grover where, you've seen him acting like Mr. D while he's talking to Percy. And then as soon as it's just Grover and Mr. D, you have that short moment where he says, he's almost reassuring Grover, and he's like, you got the boy to camp alive, don't overthink it. And then he just gives him that look, like he just talks so plainly with him, and he gets Grover's name right. And there's just clearly a slightly different relationship, obviously, that we know between Mr. D and the satyrs. But I think we're already seeing that version of Mr. D that Percy gets isn't all of Mr. D. Mm. And we talked quite a bit about the journey that will go on with Dionysus in these books and understanding his attitude towards heroes and everything. So I like that already we're seeing that there is more to Mr. D, just in our very first encounter with him.
And then we get to meet Mr. Brunner now as Chiron, get him fully introduced.
The Chiron entrance is so funny. The way he just walks in and stands there is so funny. Slow walk up. It's so silly. So Chiron takes Percy on the grand tour.
Yeah. Which was really cool. It looked like an archaeological site to me.
Yeah, the ones in Greece, specifically.
Yeah, so it looks a lot to me almost like the amphitheater that's sort of in that side of the hill. It reminds me a lot of the one that's at Dion, which is the archaeological site at the base of Mount Olympus. Dion means of Zeus, so it's a sanctuary to Zeus. But the way that amphitheater is in the hill, the way they're all kind of spaced out of the big sets and things, all the pathways and stuff, even the grass really reminds me of that, which is also interesting because those are definitely overgrown and less finished, if that makes sense. So they look like what they look like to us now, because a lot of things like wood, for example, or leather, or any kind of fabric don't survive in the Mediterranean. Except for the cabins. The cabins are what those buildings would have looked like pretty accurately. Although some are more modern than others in the way they look. You'll see some of them just look like log cabins versus some of them really look like Greek temples. Especially what I was really excited about was they're painted. The outsides are painted, which is also the way Greek temples would have been.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about looking at, all of the random statues that are all over camp.
Oh yeah,
I was trying to... stark white statues. Mm-hmm. I also paused on the cabins a lot, but it wasn't it was mainly so that I could try and figure out which cabin was whose. What we see, I think the first two that we see are Hera and Zeus. And then every other one that we see looks like, it looks like we're looking at the male god side. Because we can identify easily, like, the blue one we know is Poseidon. And then we know Hermes at the end. And so it's easy to just kind of plug in, you know, Apollo is bright yellow. It made sense that we were only looking at the male god side since we're trying to find Percy's father. Even if we don't even realize that we're looking at the male gods. What I was most focused on in this scene or this moment was the things that Chiron was saying, because like we don't get, at least here, we don't get the whole Western civilization speech from him. But he is still clearly very proud of this world and where he comes from. Like, just the way that he talks about this world and how excited he actually seems to introduce Percy to camp and to his father's world. There's a lot of respect there, and there's a lot of faith there that Percy just clearly doesn't share. And that obviously disappoints Chiron when Percy's immediately saying, like, there's no place for me here, that he doesn't want to be here.
But I think that scene also sets up a series of subversions that are good, like positive subversions for Percy.
Yes, but there actually is a place for him here.
One thing I also found interesting was instead of Western civilization also, Chiron refers to the godly world as Percy's, quote, father's world.
Which I'm thinking through what that does. Just because, you know, you associate it with Western civilization, it's the whole, like, it's all around us, it's everywhere. It still feels just, like, massive if you describe it that way, and saying that it's your father's world. It does create this, like, mental image of it being sort of a separate world, but it's also, like, connecting it personally to him by saying, like, no, this is your father's world. Without, I guess, maybe fully thinking through the fact that he doesn't feel any connection to his father.
Yeah, I just feel kind of hollow when he says that because of that. Where it's like, okay, but who is his father? Like, what does that mean? Yeah,
and so that's what I mean when I say that, like, that's kind of what I'm getting from Chiron, is that, like, he's going for awe. You should feel like this is an incredible thing that I'm introducing to you. This is your father's world, and Percy's just hitting him back with the, like, that means nothing to me.
Yeah, it's sort of like a kind of expansion on that scene in the first episode where he's just like, stories, you're special, and Percy's like,
yeah, like, I don't want that.
And then we go into the Hermes cabin, which has a central hearth, which I thought was kind of cool. And it's something that's not in every cabin, I think, because when we go into Poseidon's cabin later, there's not a hearth. There's I've been calling it a lustral basin, which is a thing that's in the Minoan palaces that Sir Arthur Evans named in case you couldn't tell. So I thought that was really interesting. I was like, oh, so there's not a hearth in every one. So we've got the hearth that means like family in the Hermes cabin. Like I said, I think it's really cool that the Montauk cabin has a hearth centrally. It also has stained glass on the wall. So again, we're kind of like recreating that a little bit here, creating this image of like comfort, like, you know, a nice, warm, comforting place. And it's interesting to me that both of those places have that. But we're procrastinating.
Right. The star of the star of this moment. This is when we meet Luke.
And we meet Luke in another one of these positive subversions where Percy is expecting to get picked on. He's expecting the same old story. He's expecting not to fit in.
But Luke is just immediately sympathetic and tells him that he's really sorry. And I think he is. Like, I genuinely think he feels for Percy. Yeah. I guess sometimes when I'm reading the book, I'm not sure what's just like a play. What's Luke making some moves and what's genuine. But here, I get maybe I'm falling for it, but I do think that Luke actually does immediately feel for Percy and care. Like, it seems like he really cares about what happens to, Luke just generally really has to care about what happens to demigods and all of the damage that the gods cause. And so, of course, he feels for Percy here.
Yeah. Like, if I'm thinking about Luke, right, like, I feel like he's also watching the kids that Annabeth's watching, just in a bit more of a subtle way. Like, he has an easier time of it being in the Hermes cabin. But, like, in this moment, he has no reason to believe that Percy is going to have anything to do with what's going on. Like, I feel like you can watch this episode from Luke's perspective and start to see the tricklings of, like, oh. Yeah. And I think the first one is when he wakes up from his Chronos dream, his next dream in the Hermes cabin. But before that, I think this is all completely genuine.
And we'll talk some more about Luke. We'll talk plenty about Luke in this episode, but we have some audio from, as you may have heard if you follow us on social media. There was a roundtable, a podcaster roundtable, where essentially a group of the Percy Jackson podcasters were put in a Zoom room with Rick and Becky, and our questions were asked of them.
Yeah, we did not get to ask our own questions, which was
We did not get to ask our own questions.
really sad. And in Mike Schubert's case, very funny. He wrote his questions out in a way where he was definitely like going to ask them in a specific way.
in his specific tone of voice.
Shout out to Mike.
But in this interview, the question that we asked of them was, what was it like to write Luke again? And so we will put that clip in here, as well as we have one of the questions that they were asked was about like which cabin they associate themselves with, which I'm not actually sure who sent in that question, but we like the answer a lot, so we're gonna play that one too.
So I know you continue to write for the trio in past books outside the Percy Jackson series, but one question was, how does it feel to go back to characters you haven't written about in a while? Luke was one example that was given. To kind of revisit those characters and add some more, things to them.
Yeah, I mean, all of these characters are very near and dear to my heart. They are like members of my family. And
Luke had to be much more three-dimensional.
He did. That was an important cast.
Yeah. I mean, what is his motivation? Why is he, doing the things he's doing and making the decisions he's making? I don't want to give too much away.
Right.
But
you're absolutely right. He needed to be three-dimensional in a way that hits you almost immediately, because you're not spending a lot of time on screen in the season with Luke, but he's such an important character for the season, for the series, that we needed to find a way to kind of reinvent him as someone who would immediately feel like a mentor figure, a really wonderful sort of big brother.
And I can spoil this, I think. In episode 2, when Percy first meets Luke, he just assumes that he's this big bully, and Luke surprises him.
Yeah.
So,
It's a lovely moment.
It is a lovely moment.
Yeah.
Obviously, with the way in the books you're claimed by the gods, which the houses would you feel most comfortable being claimed by? Which one would you want to be a part of?
Well, I don't think I've ever asked you that before. Do you have a cabin, a god?
No, actually, I don't. I mean, the set locations. I mean, obviously, and you won't see this. You won't see this on screen, but there were a lot of blue screens there on our set where the cabins are supposed to be and aren't. And the Hermes cabin was one that I spent a lot of time in, and I took pictures of, and it really drew me in. And there's things you don't see, like there's a scattering of myth and magic cards on one of the cots in there, where the people have been playing, and it's wonderful.
Hermes is the god of travelers. He's the god of found families. So I think we both felt very comfortable there. I have to say that when we ask our own sons who they would want as a godly parent, they say, why would I want a mom who's a goddess? I have Becky, which is totally true, totally fair. Best
Thank
mom
you.
right here. Sally Jackson, supreme.
And then we get this bizarre Grover scene.
Oh, yeah.
Made even stranger by the fact that it's like 4 minutes max, and we cut to black right before and right after, so it's this like really insulated little portion of the episode where Grover meets with, we learn from the credits her name is Helena, who appears to be sort of like a motherly figure to Grover.
It was funny because when we were at the premiere, Robert was sitting next to me and went through my exact thought process that I had the first time I watched it, but like in my ear, where at first they were like, Juniper?
Uh-huh.
And then they were like, no? Wait.
Yeah. That was, I mean, my reaction was also like, Juniper already? But yeah, we've heard a bit about her in a couple of interviews. She was mentioned in our interview with Dan and Tish at Comic-Con. I'm just very curious to learn more about her.
I did think it was really interesting that we are introducing a parental figure for Grover, who's one of the few characters where I think parental stuff isn't super explored.
Yes.
So I think we'll put a pin on this relationship and talk about it later in the context of, I think, parenthood and the whole series.
Yeah, and I think just once we get more context for the whole relationship in general, I feel like there's a lot more to come from this, just because we got such a like quick, mysterious glimpse at it.
I did enjoy, like, there's like these drums, we're going into this like cave vibe. Like I talked a bit in our Bad Labyrinth episode about like the origins, we think, of like Pan, and that is all very reminiscent of that.
Yeah, we get from this scene this sense, like just from this very, very brief moment of this much larger world outside of what the campers are experiencing at Camp Half-Blood, just like made up of nature, like it's all within in a tree. We're brought in by a dryad, and the music too. It just feels like this sort of otherworldly within the otherworldly. There's like this thing that's even more otherworldly, and it's inside camp, and Grover's the only one allowed in. But importantly, at the end of it, when Grover goes to Mr. D and Chiron, we see him asked again to lie to Percy.
Then we cut to my favorite recurring bit, the Kronos dreams. And he's sitting at a hearth, though, so he starts at a fire.
Yes. Well, the note that I made of that was that it was almost like slightly prophetic, because we'll later see Percy sitting by a fire, praying to his mom. A lot of hearths in this episode. A lot of looking for home and warmth. And the fact that there's a hearth here with Kronos. Like the others are, there's one in the Hermes cabin, around camp there are a couple, and in the Montauk cabin. And then there's the fire that Percy builds in the woods later. And so they're all places where Percy is finding home or building home. And then here in the desert with Kronos. And he clearly knows quite a bit more about Percy than he did in the first stream. Like, we've come a long way from who are you? So either he's keeping an eye on Percy from the pit, or someone's already telling him about him. So it starts with Percy in his raincoat by the fire, and he's watching the sand fall through his fingers, which the thoughts that I was having seeing that were partially you saying that the sand in the underworld could be like dust from monsters. But my first actual thought was that it was like sand in an hourglass. Yeah. Because I knew I was in a Kronos dream. But Kronos says, he left you here, left you with nothing. I know how you feel. Which, I'll note, we've actually heard said already in this episode by Luke, who said, I know what you're going through. And then he says, you want what's been taken from you. You want justice. And then the pit opens up.
I think it's interesting, him saying this, like, it's coming from the heart, as much as Kronos has a heart. You know, this is definitely like how Kronos is feeling, right? Like, he's left here, left with nothing. You want what's been taken from you. But we do find out later in this episode a little more about how Luke would have been feeling very similar to Percy when Percy shows up at camp. Like, he left you here with nothing. Like, all of these feelings that Luke would be feeling towards the gods in general and his parent, wanting justice.
Yeah, I want to put a star next to you want justice, because we'll get from a couple of other characters in this episode various people telling Percy basically what he should want.
Yes. That was my main note on this, actually.
Should have said it faster, I guess.
Not that specifically. I thought it was really interesting taking that you want justice line, because then immediately after this we get the scene with Luke where he talks about glory, which we'll get into, but just to finish this point, I'm going to skip past. And then we flash way forward into the capture the flag scene where Clarice is confronting Percy, and she says, now glory is fine, revenge is more fun. And I think it's interesting that this episode is sort of painting that as an interesting dichotomy of like glory versus justice. Glory versus revenge. Revenge and justice.
Yeah. And this idea that they're opposing goals from Clarice later. Well, you know, we know that both of those things are things that Luke is looking for. We'll get into this as we continue talking through Luke and Clarice's scenes. But speaking of Luke is there to comfort Percy when he wakes up from this dream. And he has fully been given the sort of mentor, leader through camp role. Like his lines here, some of them are taken from Annabeth. Because he is now the one who leads Percy through all of this. And that entire role that Annabeth played in the book isn't here anymore, which, I mean, I'm not complaining about it. I like that we're emphasizing Luke and Percy's relationship like this.
Yeah.
This was definitely a good move on their part.
Yeah.
To just kind of give them each these like solid roles that they play in this episode.
Yeah.
Also, the way that Charlie says Hermes is my father, he nailed that line delivery.
All of Charlie's line delivery is so good.
So then we get the best part of the episode.
Mm-hmm.
As they're talking, Percy says, "Why is that okay? Why do they get to bring us here to just ignore some of us?" And Luke says, "You spend too much time trying to figure out why the gods do whatever it is they do. You'll drive yourself crazy. Sooner you stop worrying about that, the sooner you can enjoy what this place actually does offer." And Percy says, "And what's that?" And Luke says, "Glory," and I laughed out loud.
I was more like, I more made that face of like, Like, I was like, oh?
And then I'll just finish the quote before we start talking about all of this. Luke says, "Demigods have always fought for glory. They used to call it kleos. It's like this stuff that attaches itself to your name. Makes it bigger, scarier, more important. People listen closer when you talk. They work harder to be your friend, and they think twice about messing with you." So
that's when I yelled. I was like, ah! My life was entirely validated.
those like 10 to 15 minutes that we spent just talking about that in our first episode all paid off in that moment. But I'm so in love with this, just like right up front, investing completely in an aspect of Luke's motivations that I think is really easy to miss in the books. Because it gets overshadowed by the like 15 other things going on with Luke. But like we talked for 20 minutes straight about in our episode on the Lightning Thief, it's such a crucial part of the speech that he gives at the end. That where's the glory in doing what others have done, and my talents were being wasted, and how similar his speech was, we said, to the Achilles like Undying Glory speech. Like, glory seeking is just so crucial to everything that we learn about Luke at the end of this book. And seeing them actually planting it this early on, it's so gratifying. It's so exciting to see Luke being written by people who like have clearly thought about where he's coming from. And it's all just, I love how they're setting it up here as this like, this is how you make people listen to you and pay attention to you and look at you. And treating kleos as like an actual thing that you are collecting.
Mm-hmm. Hearing Luke use the word kleos also tells me that he's been doing some reading.
Yeah, it's either that or it's something that people talk about at camp a lot.
Mm-hmm.
That was something I was sort of trying to figure out just because of the way that Clarice talks about it later. If this is just the way that things work at camp, or if this is a specifically Luke thing.
Alternatively, if Clarice came to camp at the same time as Luke, maybe they were just all in the same orientation class.
Back then, they used to really talk about kleos, and then now it's kind of died out, but... But speaking of Clarice, we also get our Clarice intro here.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my thoughts on Clarice are going to come later.
Yeah.
But the lines that Clarice says here, she says, "Look, you want attention around here. You better be ready for it when it comes." Which I took to mean either she's just referencing the fact that like Grover went around and told everyone the story, which he says when Percy first wakes up. And so this has been spreading around camp. And so she assumes that he wants attention, and that's why that story is traveling around, because he's spreading it. Or she walked up and already knew exactly what Luke was probably talking about.
I wouldn't be surprised if Luke talks about that a lot, though, is the thing. Like,
Yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised.
She's like, "Oh, Luke's talking to the new kid. I bet I know what he's telling him."
Sort of like, oh yeah, whenever there's a new kid that shows up, Annabeth just stalks them for a while, and Luke's like, "So kleos."
Just everyone knows what those two get up to when there's a new person at camp. But yeah, we'll come back to Clarice. But after this, Percy takes it a step further and says that like, "Oh, if I get glory, I can make my dad pay attention to me," basically. And then Luke has a wild line and says, "You can't force the gods to do anything."
Basically, the whole time, Luke's just like, let's not take it too far, kid. Let's simmer down. Let's take it back a notch.
And then Percy says, "Yeah, but it would make it harder for him to pretend I don't exist." And I'm just keeping an eye on this exchange because it's being played like you can't force the gods to do anything, but maybe, like, I hadn't thought of that before. But we know, like, he's already stolen the bolt at this point. Like, he's already trying to force the gods into a war. And when we read The Lightning Thief, we said that this was maybe him also trying to force Hermes to look at him like Percy is now. So I was trying to figure out how to read the maybe in this scene.
Oh, I think he's thinking about his own question in this part.
As in he's sort of like...
Maybe,
like...
not in my experience, but maybe.
See, I wasn't sure whether I should be reading it as that or if I should be reading it as, like, Luke being impressed or, like, seeing himself in Percy immediately. And, like Luke probably wants to get Percy's dad's attention, too. Like, he wants to know who Percy's father is, too. And so it's like he has thought about that before, and maybe someday. Maybe that's exactly what I'm trying to do, maybe.
We then get a montage of Percy trying to figure out what he's good at. But it was interesting that they were doing archery and then forgery. So it's like, oh, we're doing Apollo and then Hephaestus.
Right.
Who are the two most, like, prolific gods for children besides, like, Hermes. So it feels like he's taking him through, like, I'm starting to maybe think there's something up with this kid. Let's take him through and see. Let's see what he's good at in that, like, let's put him to the test.
Like, maybe that's kind of where a lot of this is coming from Luke, just trying to figure out who his dad is, while also at the same time realizing, like, this kid seems like he thinks a lot like me. Like, he might be exactly what I'm looking for.
Yeah. Like, I think this is definitely something that they probably do with most new campers. Like, I think there's a dual motive of, like, yeah, let me help this kid out. Let me help him figure it out. Let me take him through the paces. But I think there's also maybe a little bit of a motive of, like, okay, but, like, we should probably figure this out because I need to figure out if this kid's going to be a problem for me.
Before we go any further, we got to ask Jon Steinberg about his thoughts on Kleos because we know he has them. This was an interview with Jon and Dan and James, which we also brought up in the last episode. Please enjoy.
Speaking of mythology, though, so something that Phoebe and I have talked about a lot is Luke's relationship to Glory and Achilles. So I was extremely excited when I heard him actually say the word Kleos in episode 2. Like, let out a yell, excited. Because it's a pretty loaded word in Greek. So I was, and I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about once we get to the end of the season. But I was really curious about your approach to this introduction of Luke.
Big shout out to Professor Naj at Harvard. That was my freshman classical heroes class, was all Kleos and Nostos, and I think is hopefully all through this show. Also a good friend of Rick's, as it turns out. But I think it kind of makes sense to me that, you know, if you're Luke and you don't realize you're in somebody else's book, you're in your own story. And the idea of serving the gods is just not a story you want to be in. This idea of there being something in it for you that you deserve, you know, for all of this, the sacrifices you've had to make and the things you've had taken away from you, makes sense. And then to be able to tie that into something that's really foundational to all of these stories, canonically, mythically, you know, the idea of, you know, glory seeking and homecoming and how, you know, and the tension between those two ideas is really all of these stories. I was very excited that James shot that wide in a way that nobody made me take that line out. I was very afraid when we wrote it. I was afraid that when I wrote that, there's no way this is going to the show, but I'm doing it. And it made it. It made it. I was very excited. I'm glad you noticed that.
Yeah,
you and Dan made
that was awesome, guys.
So Percy completes his training montage. No sword fighting in sight yet, which I have thoughts on that I'll come back to later. But we then see Percy sitting with Luke and Chris. It's crazy that Chris is involved, that he's so close with these two specifically.
I love it. It's so good. And then Percy's like, oh, is there a god of disappointment? And Chris says, Oasis, which is a deep cut. That's a deep cut.
And he's clearly been thinking about it for a long time. Like, he's considered this one.
Well, though, what's also interesting is I looked up this goddess, because I was like, oh, I'm curious where she's referenced. And it's in Hesiod, one of the most ancient, like, the theogony is a bunch of tales of like gods and stuff, but the part where Oasis is in is like the beginning of the world, like chaos and all that fun stuff. So I'm sitting here like, oh, why is Chris Rodriguez looking up the most ancient account we have of, the origin of the Titans? I don't know. Why are we reading? Why are we doing that reading? Why were we looking that up? I don't know.
Why would he do such a thing?
This is what I'm saying. They're doing research, Phoebe. This is what I was saying before. Luke's been doing research. They've been reading Homer. They've been reading Hesiod.
And then Luke explains the way that making offerings to the gods works. He tells him, you burn what you'll miss the most. Then they know you really mean what you're about to say, so they'll listen. And then Percy goes and builds his own fire in the forest and burns the candy that his mom gave him. And that alone,
I was like, ugh.
Made my heart clench. And then he starts praying to his mom, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh my god. I loved this. I loved this so much. That he hears that this is how you can get in touch with the gods. And we've seen him throughout this episode trying to find a way to get in touch with his father and to get him to notice him. But when he actually hears that there is a way that he can reach out, his immediate thought just goes straight back to his mom. Like, all of this always just goes straight back to Sally.
And it's not even like a prayer. It's just like, this is the call you get when I go to a new school. Like, he's not praying to her. He's just trying to call her. He's just trying to talk to her. And he's trying to talk to her because he's actually having an okay time. Like, and he wants to talk about it. He wants to talk to his mom because he made friends. It's just like, ugh.
Like, the 2 points he hits in this are just, Mom, I have friends, and I am gonna find my dad. That anger at his father, the, like, ignoring me is one thing, but he doesn't get to ignore you. I'm gonna make him come down here. I'm gonna make him see me. I'm gonna make him see us both. I love hearing lines come out of Percy's mouth that would have come out of Luke's mouth.
Yeah, I wrote that exact quote down, and then I wrote, very Luke of him.
Like, I feel like they are really doubling down on the sort of Luke and Percy as eventually being sort of foils, and that, like, they both started in the same place and then took very different paths. It's the good kid reprise of it all. But it just feels like, with the Chronos dreams and with Percy's mindset in this episode, and then like later when we get the story about Thalia, it's almost like we're watching another version of Luke's story when he first arrived at camp. Like, we're seeing this kid who feels abandoned by their father and then experiences this massive loss the moment that they get to camp, and so comes in angry and looking for someone to blame. And with Chronos in the back of their mind, telling them, I know how you feel. Let me help you. And I also, unrelated to this, I was also thinking about, even though this isn't quite how the offerings to the gods works, like, he's not that far off. Like, we'll learn much later, like, summoning ghosts from the underworld is obviously a much more involved process, but it is offering up food to the dead in the same way you'd offer up food to the gods.
And then Percy returns, and we get our iconic Supreme Lord of the Bathroom scene.
His little, hey guys, can't sleep? I was like, you know what's coming. Like, what?
And it's so interesting that this is sort of the welcome he was expecting, right? Like, this is what he was expecting.
And he goes into it just like all smiles, which is just so funny to me.
He's like, oh, there they are. Okay, now I get my
He's
check.
like, here it comes. But we get a line from Clarice in this scene that I've been tracking the word special, but Clarice says, every new kid shows up here and they think they're special. Do you think you're special? And Percy says no.
Yeah, he doesn't.
Because like I mentioned last episode, Percy does not like the word special. Percy does not like the word special. It feels condescending and like someone is like classifying him as something or trying to explain him to himself. And he doesn't like that. But at the same time, it's something that it seems like every kid here is striving for and is trying to achieve, is glory, is to be special. Which, I mean, it kind of depends on how you're going to define special, because the two people who we've associated the word special with this point are Chiron and Sally, because they're the two who have used stories to try and explain to Percy why he's special. And we've heard both of them. Later in the episode, we'll hear Chiron tell Percy that he's singular. And that's also the word that Sally used at the end of the last episode. And so if your definition of special is similar to the word singular, I mean, he kind of is.
This is where I think we can get into, like, why is Clarice so bothered by this?
Yeah, because Clarice, what we get from this scene and from our later scene with her, she wants very badly for Percy to admit that he made up the fight with the Minotaur. Which you figure when you hear it from the glory rules that we've learned so far, you'd think Clarice doesn't like Percy taking all of that glory for himself. But later in the episode, we'll hear Clarice say, yeah, glory's fine, but revenge is more fun. And also in The Last Olympian, we talked a lot about Clarice's relationship with Glory as the sort of Achilles stand-in. And we landed closer to Clarice caring about respect and reputation. And that's where I think I see this coming from.
I was thinking about it like, if the Ares cabin are supposed to be the biggest, baddest, toughest campers, and like then this 12-year-old shows up that's just killed a Minotaur by himself. The Minotaur is probably the most badass monster kill the camp's had in a minute, and it happened like right there. So that's definitely probably weighing on her, where she's just like, that should have been me. I'm the one that should have bagged the baddest monster, not this 12-year-old. They're all probably sitting there like, okay, well, he's not one of ours.
Well, how do they know?
Well, that's a good point. They don't really test him, do they?
Right? And that's like something that I've always thought is that like Ares probably should have been the first thought when Percy showed up.
It's because he's blonde.
It's because he's blonde. But yeah, I am always in the book and here. I'm always surprised that no one thinks that's an Ares kid.
Yeah, but I do think it sort of sets up this precedent of like, we hear about glory from Luke, and then we immediately kind of see that in action a little bit of how it's a finite resource.
That people are going to fight you over.
Yeah, it's like, oh, you have glory, I'm going to challenge you.
Yeah, which is why I'm excited to see more of Clarice, because we know seeking glory and seeking respect kind of seem like the same thing, but there is a line there, and that's why Clarice is brushing off glory at the end of this episode. And also, a part of what she wants is the same thing that all of them want, which is for her dad to look at her and treat her with some respect. It's the kind of thing that you have to like peel it back. It seems like it's easy on the surface, but you have to keep peeling it back with Clarice.
Also, I think the 5 years at camp here plays up the difference as well, because I guess we'll find out in the show if she's a full-time camper, but I'm pretty sure in the book she is, which means that she, like Annabeth and Luke, have not left. Well, except for Luke, actually, because he had a quest. But she, like Annabeth, has not left camp in 5 years and has not really had a chance to, like, prove herself.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Percy becomes Supreme Lord of the Bathroom.
Yes, and still doesn't put 2 and 2 together.
And we get our first real Annabeth scene.
Yes. And we just, like, learn nothing.
I know. I feel like it's very book accurate, though, where she's just like, I've been waiting for something like this to happen. And, like, she's seen the water, so she's like, okay. Like, it's very unambiguous from her sightline. And the fact that she's probably, again, just been with her invisibility cap the whole time, because that's why we don't see her. I'm assuming. She's just been following around with her invisibility cap on.
Probably.
And, like, that's the moment she takes it off, and she's like...
Yeah, like, okay, you've proven my theory. Let's talk. She's very, like, I'm not giving you any information until you ask me for it. And then the information I give you might not even be true, because like, when she's like, oh, I'm just trying to figure out if we can win capture the flag with you. And then, like, we know that's not true.
But I get the sense from the way she delivers the line almost that when she's saying win capture the flag, she means get Poseidon to claim you, not like win capture the flag.
Right. Because we'll learn immediately from Luke that, like, this is how you get glory.
Also, just like he says the line like she's thinking 9 steps ahead, and it's like that's 9 steps ahead. That's
about exactly nine scenes ahead.
Yeah.
I think he says 4 steps ahead, so it might be exactly 4 steps, 4 scenes. But yeah, she places herself right where he'll see her, very intentionally, like inviting questions, but without anticipating answering most of them. And this is how we meet Annabeth. Keeping true to the Annabeth remaining a little bit of a mystery throughout the first book feeling.
I did think it was interesting, like, because I think reading the book, you know, you get told all of their ages, but I remember as a 12-year-old, I'm reading it, and I'm like, Luke, like, they say he's, like, what, 18? What does a 19-year-old even look like? No. And I think I pictured him as, like, a 14-year-old when I was I remember when I was reading it. So I'm like, oh, yeah, he's, like, not that much older. It's fine. This is just who we hang out with. It's interesting to see, like, an actual 18-year-old referring to an actual 12-year-old as, like, a mastermind behind everything. Because I was like...
And, like, that's what I was thinking, is that he talks about her like, oh, she's the greatest warrior in camp. She's the head counselor, and then it cuts to 12-year-old
And she's just teeny.
No, you can't say that because we're her height. We learned in person that we're her height.
That's true.
But it's building up the mystery of Annabeth, because you see someone that much older than her treating her with that much respect. And it's like, how did this happen? Who is this girl?
To me, it was just like something that I'd never really thought about before, because in my head, like, Luke is like a couple years older, not like older. At least when I was like first reading it, and I think the impression kind of stuck because I was reading the books when I was the same age as Percy and Annabeth, so I'm like, yeah, I'm almost an adult. I was not almost an adult, but I thought I was for sure. So that's something else that stood out to me too, is when Percy is like, oh, I've really made some friends, where I'm like, those are like 19-year-olds, dude.
Yeah. But I mean, I feel like that's kind of what you think when you're that young. You're like,
no, that's yeah, like, I believe him. It's just me as an adult watching it is like, oh, honey, this is giving me kindergartner sitting at the back of the bus energy. Like, I certainly believe those fifth graders were my besties, but like, they definitely did not see me that way.
I think it seems like Luke and Chris do enjoy Percy's company and see him. To me, they see him as like a mini them. Like, Luke especially seems really genuine in wanting Percy around. And I think Luke has to care about other demigods. Like, that's one of the things that you have to set up at the beginning. And then for Percy, for obvious reasons, has kind of latched onto them because they're being very nice to him, and he doesn't have anyone anymore now that he's sort of pushed Grover away. And Grover is avoiding him. So at least Luke and Chris. I know we see a couple of other Hermes campers like hanging around them, but at least Luke and Chris have become sort of pillars in his life because he didn't have any. So then we get the intro to Capture the Flag. I love Luke's line at the beginning of this scene where he's like, you're gonna love this. Camp-wide, mock warfare, all glory to the victors. I was like, maybe you love that. It was just Luke assumes Percy thinks exactly like him. Like, at this point, it seems like he really thinks, oh, this kid is just like me. It's just the way it seems like he thinks that seeking glory is something that like Percy really, really wants. Well, it's just sort of a means to an end for Percy.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Like, for Percy, it's a means to an end, which is, I think, what we see in that scene we were talking about for a while between them, where he's like, oh, and then I can use it to get this. Versus for Luke, that it is its own reward.
Beyond that, he's just made it like, it seems a core part of who he is. Because he brings it up every time you see him.
Yeah. I love that he calls her Annabeth his little sister too.
Yes. And then he says that he's always on her side. I was like, no! Oh no!
This is also the scene I did the statue deep dive on, because we see a big statue in the middle of the field while they're drilling, and I was like, who is that? But interestingly, my break in the case was when we went to the premiere, because this statue is in the background of the Met shot, this exact statue. That statue is in the Met collection. I was looking at it and I was thinking, oh, well, it's in the middle of the field where they do like military drills. So it's a guy with like longer hair and like these animal skins, and then there's a smaller figure of a woman next to him who's got like a veil and a candle. And at first glance, I was like, I think that's Ares and Eris, because when you see Ares is usually depicted with Eris, like that's pretty common. I looked it up, and it's a statue of Dionysus. And the woman next to him they think is Spes. It's a Roman reproduction of a Greek bronze statue, they think. Spes, which is hope, the goddess of hope. I was like, oh, Dionysus and Hope is like the giant statue in the middle of the field. That's interesting. It's interesting because this is like clearly an older vision of him, and it doesn't really make sense for his statue to be in this field. Like, it makes more sense for it to be an Ares statue, which is why I originally thought it was an Ares statue. So it's clearly like something that was put there when Mr. D took over as camp counselor. And like, he definitely probably, unless this was like the thing where they knew he was, because this happened where there was a point in Athens' history where they'd accidentally bet on the wrong horse 2 Roman civil wars in a row. So the first time they bet against Sulla, and as you might have gathered from my short rant on Sulla, one of my favorite chaotic historical figures of all time. he came to Athens and was like, you bet against me in the Roman Civil War. And he sacked Athens, which was bad. Calamity. It was terrible. And then however many years later, Athens once again bets on Mark Antony over Augustus. And obviously Augustus wins. And so they're like, oh no, he's going to come sack us again. And so they built a giant statue of Agrippa, which is Augustus's general. He was sending to Athens on a horse and put it just right on top of the building that's the entrance to the Acropolis. And they were like, maybe if we do that, he won't be mad. So I wonder if like maybe that was the logic of like, well, Mr. D is going to be pissed by the fact that he's been exiled here as camp counselor. So maybe if we put a giant statue of him in the middle of camp, he won't like be mean. Maybe he'll be a little nicer.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
That's my headcanon now.
Yeah, it makes me wonder when because we see a couple of other tiny little statues. It makes me wonder when those were put in too. But, so Luke tells Percy about Annabeth in this scene, which I love that we're seeing this relationship from Luke's perspective from the beginning, because in the book, I find that a lot of their relationship comes from Annabeth. Like, I actually can't remember hearing much of Luke talking about Annabeth, and so I like that we're getting to know that relationship from Luke's perspective, which we continue to do in the next scene when he starts talking about Thalia. And that he's the one who tells that story. Because in the book, that information comes from Grover. But we're not talking to him right now. So it was funny because when I watched it, I was like, there's no way they give Percy all of this information at this point in the story already. But then I looked back and Grover does. At this exact part of the book, he tells Percy all of this. And I was like, that's crazy.
Honestly, Lightning Thief musical, I think they did a good job with that, though.
I mean, The Tree on the Hill is the most incredible song ever written.
11 o'clock number, all the way. Let's do it. Like...
But it's also like, if you do want Luke to tell this story, you have to put it up front like this. And when you have Luke tell this story, it does sort of double duty and continues the Luke and Percy parallel because both lost people on the hill. So that's another place where you can have Percy see himself in Luke.
I think to quote you, she's a ghost in the whole first book. So I like that we're bringing her in to be the ghost.
You know what's hilarious? That's a great point, past Phoebe. But you know what's hilarious? My sister's boyfriend is watching the show right now with he's never read the books or anything. He doesn't know anything. And his theory is that Thalia is still alive somewhere and she's the real villain. That's going to be the twist. He thinks Luke is so nice and so is sure he's going to die at some point because he's too nice, and that Thalia is the real villain.
You gotta film his reaction to episode 8.
But anyway, yes, set up the ghost from the beginning. And clearly people are feeling her. If that's a theory that's out there, people are feeling her.
But the way the writing is tricking us is it's like we're building a strong foundation of Luke for the exposition, and then so that he can set up Annabeth, who is now going to take over as like the real other main character. Yeah. And I really think it does trick you the way this is written. Because as soon as they're on the quest, we've got the shoes, but that's pretty much it. And I'm sure we're going to get the Iris message at some point as well. But like, I like that a lot of what he is doing is because we know setting him up very much as a character, but it's also sort of cloaked in like...
I'm the exposition character.
Exposition that's important to Percy, and that's also important to setting up Annabeth. Because I do think, I love the way she's introduced of like, you hear all the rumors first, you hear all the reputation first, and then you get the myth, the legend herself.
They do a good job of like, because I feel like a lot of the time when I give people my age the Lightning Thief, they all guess that it's Luke.
Oh yeah.
And so I feel like kind of disguising him as sort of this mentor exposition figure who's going to help Percy, and like really just establishing him as that, while also kind of dropping in those very small hints that like only we hopefully will recognize. It seems like it's working so far. But anyway, I love the Annabeth Luke interaction also that we get in the next part of this scene, where she's sort of giving orders and he says, "Yes, ma'am." Yeah. Joint leadership.
I got weirdly fixated on the fact that they're the only ones wearing pauldrons, which are shoulder armor. And then I noticed when there's that scene of Luke fighting off a bunch of Ares kids, the girl who surrenders to him is also wearing pauldrons. And I was like, oh, I think this is what the commanders wear. This marks the commanders. Which is important and interesting because Clarice does not have pauldrons on. So that made me be like, wait, is Clarice not in charge?
She must be.
Or maybe they're the cabin leaders. Maybe that's it. I'm assuming that maybe the girl that surrenders to Luke, maybe she's the actual head of the Ares cabin and Clarice is just like, I don't know. It made me interested to be like, what's the Clarice lore here? Like, is she the head? Is she in charge? Or is she just sort of like the best warrior? Is she the Achilles? She's not in charge. She's just the best warrior.
This scene with Luke fighting, I remember when we were talking about, because we saw this clip at Comic-Con. I remember when we were talking about it, I brought up the line that Luke has to Chris, because to me it felt like, you know, out of context, it felt like them talking about secret things. When he says, he's talking about Percy, and he says, when it's time, he's going to be ready, I know it. And so in my head, I was like, you can't have Luke talking to Chris on their own and expect me not to, like, put my own Chronos spin on it.
I didn't get it, but then you pointed it out, and I'm rewatching it, and I'm like, I do think that line has a little extra weight to it.
It does. There's just like a tiny little bit. It's like there's a little bit of extra weight that the scene is putting on it.
I think it's like an Easter egg. I think it's just like you go back and you're like, ah.
That's what I still am sort of like, I think that's what that is. It's very subtle, but I'm also like, if that is what that is, that means that I need to figure out what it means and what they're talking about. Because it very easily could be like, you know, they both obviously at this point have their plans. And if they're thinking, because I mean, Percy is a great candidate for them at this point.
Yeah.
If they're thinking we should bring Percy on board, Luke probably sees a lot of potential in him, and Chris might think, you know, this kid, we haven't even figured out what he's good at. Like, I don't know. I don't know if he's worth it. He has our attitude, but like, I don't know what else he can do. And so that's where the line, when it's time, he's going to be ready, I know it might be that's where that line might be coming from. But I could just be reading into things in the way that I love to do.
I think there's something there. I do. I think that's...
I do. I just... It just seems like the way that there's like a pause before he says it. There's just the way that it's framed. It just feels like a line that you're supposed to come back to. I don't know.
Yeah. I do love the start to capture the flag. We get our second Percy Annabeth scene. And here's something I noticed most recent time I watched. So when Percy trips and falls, he's trying to fix the strap. And he trips and falls because he's not paying attention to the ground because he's trying to fix the strap on his armor. So I love how that frames this scene differently to me because he's trying to fix his strap while talking to Annabeth, trips and falls on his face, gets up and is like, okay. And she doesn't help him at all. But then like the scene ends with her fixing the strap that is like the reason why he tripped in the first place.
I didn't notice that. That makes sense because then it's sort of like Annabeth was still paying attention to him. She was walking ahead of him and like was clearly, you know, acting like she wasn't paying any attention to him, but she still had an eye back there.
She's paying attention. I think it's also a little moment of like, she's not out to get him, you know?
No. Yeah. And I think at this point she's also figured out that he's probably a Poseidon kid.
He must be the one.
I wonder how much of like what's going on with the gods and everything that she knows, because I think in the book she, or at least people, talk about how it seems like there is something going on with the gods right now. And that, like, everyone's sort of aware of it, that, like, something seems wrong. I think she's the one who says that she, from what she's heard, knows that the gods are angry and that something is missing. Because in the book, she always seems, like, slightly more in the loop than anyone else because of her relationship with Chiron.
Yeah, something else we don't really see, is it?
The Chiron and Annabeth relationship? No, not yet. So then we get the fight with Clarice.
It's so good. Like, the choreography, the way it's done, is something that sometimes bothers me in group fight scenes when the people that are in the group are not using their numbers effectively. But I also do think that something that this does kind of establish, and again, this makes me wonder, is Clarice the general here? It shows to me that she's not as strategic. Like, her in compared to Annabeth. Like, that's just not a part of her character. She's much more like... Yeah, I'm driven by revenge. I'm driven by, like, just being a fighter. And I think it shows in the scene as well, where there's the two other kids that are helping her out, but they're never, like, coordinating attacks. They're not really, like, doing anything. They're just kind of, like, basically keeping Percy pinned enough so that Clarice can just kind of wail on him.
Yeah. This scene also, it's why I forgive them for not including the sword fighting. Because I think this is the answer to we'll find what you're good at. Because we've seen now these two fights, like the Minotaur fight and the Clarice fight, where like in the books he has other things at his disposal that he uses. Like in the Minotaur fight, it's a lot of like using a lot of strategy, using the trick that his mom uses here in the show, the bullfighting trick to try and get on its back and everything. But in the show, he's just going on pure instinct and is able to finish that fight. And then here in the book, he's losing this fight and then falls into the water, and then that gives him the extra strength that he needs to beat Clarice. But here he doesn't end up in the water. It just comes to him naturally. So I think that it's fighting. Fighting is what he's good at. I was surprised that we got rid of him falling into the water at first, because I was like, oh, well, that's like the big hint. Like it's almost like Poseidon claims him because he can't deny it anymore.
Yeah.
In the book. But here it's just he finds exactly what he's good at, and that's when Poseidon claims him. Kind of exactly like he and Luke were kind of hoping would happen.
Yeah. It's interesting also because I just realized that at this point, the only person he's not at some point felt betrayed by is Luke.
Yeah. What Luke said would happen, happened. Look at that. Luke is just like a really supportive friend.
Yeah. He would never betray Percy Jackson. I love that betrayal is just being a thing in the show. I love that.
Yeah. And I mean, like I think you were about to say, that shot of Luke and Chris looking at Luke.
Yep. And that's the moment where they're like, uh-oh.
You see it all come together in their heads.
And Percy's like staring at it. He doesn't look happy to be claimed.
Doesn't look happy, but does seem, that kind of kicked puppy look isn't on his face anymore. But yeah, this wasn't at all the glorious moment that they were kind of looking for to Percy. This was scary and upsetting. Like at the end of the scene, he just looks wrecked. But then immediately gets the message from his dad that, like, this is what he's looking for from him.
And then he's taken to cabin 3. There's, like, cages. It looks like the Natural History Museum, like with all the skeletons hanging down.
Yeah.
It's also got, like I said, a lustral basin in the middle instead of a hearth.
Yeah, and because of that, and because it's so blue and, like, kind of dark in there, it just, versus the Hermes cabin, you can feel how empty it is.
The Hermes cabin just feels so lived in. There's so many people in there. There's so many bunks, but it's not like cramped like it's described in the books. It
feels really warm,
cozy.
And
it's not like cramped. It's comfortable and like full of people. I think also like me saying it looks and feels kind of like a museum. Like I mean that. Like it doesn't feel like a place that people have lived. It feels like a museum, which is true because people have not lived there in quite some time.
Mm-hmm. And I was just, after an episode of a lot of warm lighting and orange and just all of that color, it's that return to the blue. Mm-hmm. Which if I can transition us, we did get the chance to ask Dan and Tish, our production designer and costume designer, about the use of color and about the cabins. So here's a little bit of their perspective on creating camp. Something I've been really struck by is the overall tone and color language that you're both using, like because it isn't necessarily bright, really. It is in moments, but it's a little bit moody, a little bit blue. You've got some muted colors, which I love. So can you guys talk a little bit about the color story that we have happening here?
From the set point of view, it's really about trying to be in the book, in the place, and like Camp Half-Blood, for example, is all about bringing color that's true to the god that it represents, and of course Ares would be black and gold, and Poseidon would be various aquas. Hermes is all about comfort colors, creams and greens and things like that. And I guess the other one that was at the beginning anyway, that was not challenging, but it was a sort of a step away from the norm, was the Montauk cabin, and going for those sun-bleached colors. And it's as though there's a group of people have owned this property, and each one has added something each summer that they've come to stay there. I'll bring a pot of paint and I'll paint a wall, and they paint one wall, and then summer's over and they go home, and so you get a different pot of paint next year. So that concept of having something with a history and giving the history through color. Tish.
Well, I would use as an example. First of all, I just want to say that we had a lot of dialogue back and forth between our departments as to what was cohesive, what would work in the environment. I was always checking to see if they had already started work on a particular set. I had the concern of, like, Dan's building and painting like specific sets, whereas I've got 3 kids that have to go through all of these sets and worlds. And so I had to choose colors that I knew would work everywhere, because they have to be recognizable, they have to stand out, they have to work together, but they can't be jarring when they go into the areas which are devoid of color. They still have to be visible when they go into areas that are full of color, like the casino in Las Vegas, and we still want to be able to track them and see them. And just taking, for example, I would say Annabeth. She had like a jean shirt and a striped t-shirt. You would not recognize what those things look like from the beginning, like to the final process, because we just over dye, remove color, dye, color, throw color back in. It was a continual process until we found something that we thought, would work. And as another example, the color orange for the t-shirts at Camp Half-Blood. That was hours and hours and days of dyeing. We first had all of our oranges color tested to see what would work, again, under, like gloomy skies and the bright sunlight and inside the cabins. And of course, you couldn't get that color of orange, so we had to dye everything, but there were limited quantities. So we were working with t-shirts that were white to start with, t-shirts that were yellow to start with, t-shirts that were melon colored to start with. And we had to find a way of making sure that we could get that perfect color of orange with all of our disparate sources. And they all have to be like hand dyed in order to have the color fixed. If you don't fix your colors, and you can only do that hot water in a pot, like stirring, then every time you wash something, it's going to go. So there was a lot of, we had a massive dye department. There was a lot of dyeing, a lot of over dyeing. And, I think it was well worth it. I think it worked really well cohesively together with the other departments.
And then our last scene for this episode is Percy being called to the big house, where they finally tell him the plot of the book. They tell him that Zeus's master bolt has been stolen and that he is the prime suspect, but that they believe that the bolt has been taken by Hades. So he is being given a quest to go to Hades to try and get the bolt from him, which Percy refuses completely. We've spent this whole episode thinking, like, I need to get in touch with my father. I have to get his attention, all of this. And then the second that Percy actually has these opportunities to get in touch with his father, either with, offering some food to him, he doesn't use that opportunity. And then this time, he's been claimed. His father literally needs him, is what Chiron is telling him right now, is that his dad needs him right now. And Percy refuses.
I was thinking about subversion a little bit here, because I think something that's really interesting is I feel like if the events that happened at the end of, the color story, I think, informs this as well, where I feel like if the events that happened at the end of this episode had happened before he had all of his expectations about Camp Half-Blood, before he'd met Luke and everything, before they were subverted, getting, at the beginning as well, where he's like, where do I belong? Where do I fit in? And all this stuff that at the beginning of the episode, they're sort of painted as this is the pathway to getting what you want, Percy. then all of a sudden we've got all this middle stuff where all of the rest of his expectations get subverted. He's starting to feel like he belongs. And then it's at that point that he actually starts to get the recognition of being claimed, a chance to actually connect with his dad. But all of the stuff in the middle has now made those almost redundant, because what he actually wants are those connections that he's forming. He wants like a home. He's lost. He just needs some amount of like positive stuff going on. And I think that's what this episode's arc kind of shows. It's like, how did we get to him refusing? It's because of all the stuff that happened in the middle.
Right, the no-stos of it all. But yes, Percy obviously does still resent his father and does still have all of those feelings. But like I think we talked about in our Lightning Thief episode, a lot of the core of what Percy's looking for a lot of the time is safety and security. And I think the longer he spends with Luke and in the Hermes cabin, the more he feels like he's found that. Or like he might be able to find that at camp. And also, like he says here, his mom gave her life so that he could be safe here. And so giving up that security to go on a quest like this would be throwing out his mom's sacrifice. And as much as he would like to confront his dad just isn't really a part of a lot of the things that he actually wants here.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, though, is like we see him going to pray to who we think he's praying to his dad, but he's praying to his mom. Like it's those levels too, where he starts the episode just feeling really lost and not knowing where to turn. So he thinks, okay, I guess my father, because this is his world, I'm going to turn to him. And I think the more into the world he actually gets, the more he's like, oh, actually, I wasn't looking for my dad. I was looking for anybody who understands me.
It feels like he's found a couple of solid people and solid ways that he thinks he can move forward. And then Grover comes in and says, actually, your mom is still alive and you can go get her. It almost, it like interrupts the healing process. Where it's this kind of like he's gotten past denial. He's working through all of that. And then Grover comes in and is like, head right back to step one. Your mom is still alive and you can go get her. And obviously that changes everything. So, beads. My first thought was a hearth, specifically the one in the can that Percy makes.
I think my bead's one of the like graffiti drawings of heroes in the Hermes cabin. That's my bead.
Okay, I'll have to actually
Next
see
time
them.
you watch it, just pause it when Luke's talking to Percy
Okay.
at first. It's like a graffitied like warrior with a sword.
Thank you all for listening to Monster Donut. Next time we will be discussing, I was about to say reading. We will be discussing. We visit the Garden Gnome Emporium, which, no spoilers, incredible episode. I can't wait to talk about this one. And we will be doing it with some special guests. So, if you have questions or thoughts that we should include in our eventual season 1 wrap-up, you can get in touch at monsterdonutpodcast@gmail.com or on social media at PJOpod, on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok.
You can also hear all of our predictions on our Patreon if you sign
Yes,
up.
hang on. Let me pull up our new Patreon. People were signing up as we were talking, so there are
Really?
ultra new ones. There are some ultra new people in here. Thank you to our patrons. Wow, look at that. Thank you to our patrons. RK, Window Wells, Emily Ann Bonney, Roman Consul, Latino Kea, Patty VCK, and Bethany Ayers Fisher. Thank you all so much. This has only been up for like a day, so this is impressive.
It means the world to us. It's so much fun to share this all with you, and we hope that you also have a great time sharing your stuff with us. Please do. We love. My favorite thing ever is getting emails from y'all and reading your theories. It's the best. And questions. Especially shout out to the people that have sent very specific classics questions. Thank you. I will answer them in a very long email. Thank you also to those who have shown their support non-monetarily by either recommending us to a friend or sharing us, tweeting at us, or leaving a review or a rating. That also really helps us out.
And as always, you can find our merch at monsterdonut.redbubble.com. I should design some new merch.
for season 2.
Yeah, I've got to. Oh, you know what I should get? You know what I should make is just make a sweatshirt or something that all it says across the front is Cleos. Okay, bye everybody.
Till next time. Bye.